So welcome everyone. Today I'd like to talk about how we create our suffering with our conceptual and constructed realities, and how we can find freedom from that with some emptiness practices. And I'll mention the emptiness practices of silent illumination from Chan Buddhism, Shikantaza from Japanese Zen Buddhism, and also signless samadhi, which is described in the Buddha's shorter discourse on emptiness. But first, I want to make reference to a wonderful film that I watched must be about 20 years ago now, I think. Almost 20 years ago. And it was the first film of The Matrix. Remember The Matrix? That wonderful film. The first one, much better than the ones that followed, but anyway, the first one. I just got this out of Wikipedia because I wanted to find out exactly what Neo was told in terms of the blue and the red pills. So, in The Matrix, the main character, Neo, is offered a choice between a red pill and a blue pill by the rebel leader Morpheus. Morpheus says, "You take the blue pill and the story ends. You wake up in your bed and you believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I'll show you how deep the rabbit hole goes." Now the red pill represents an uncertain future, unknown to Neo at the time, and he takes the red pill. It would free him from enslaving control of the machine-generated dream world and allow him to escape into the real world. But living the truth of reality is harsher and more difficult. On the other hand, the blue pill represents a beautiful prison. It would lead him back to ignorance, living in confined comfort without want or fear within the stimulated reality of the Matrix. But Neo chooses the red pill and joins the rebellion. So I hope everyone's seen The Matrix and it'll make sense what I'm talking about. But if you haven't seen it, it's a wonderful film, and there's similarities what's described in The Matrix to some particular traditions in the Buddhist teachings, or some particular traditions that have developed from the Buddhist teachings. And so there's a correlation, and what the Buddha talks about is how we constantly make choices about what we feed into with our attention and what we don't. And I've given talks on attention and how we can feed into and nourish wholesomeness, and also feed into and denourish unwholesomeness, for example. But when in this process of creating our suffering, we often choose a path of ignorance, like the blue pill. And we choose that because it's familiar and it's comfortable. And it's comfortable in the short term, but we don't see the long-term effects of it. We don't see how much we're bound in a kind of prison of our ignorance. We tend to do what we've always done and we'll get what we've always got. And if we do what we've always done in a way that is driven by greed, ignorance and hatred, what will happen is we'll always get dukkha, or suffering. So in fact, if we choose the blue pill, for example, and if we choose to continue with life as we've always lived it in a deluded way, then we'll always get what we've always got, being dukkha. And this is considered as a bind. It's the binds of samsara in Buddhism. And we become bound by our habits and our beliefs and our preconceived ideas and our concepts about the world. We develop concepts about the world and we project them onto the world, and we believe them to be true. We believe them to be real. Whereas in fact they're just our concepts being projected out in the world. And so one often hears in Buddhism that we create our worlds with our mind, and dukkha is often created and sustained by how we create our worlds with mental formations. And we believe them to be true. And I mentioned earlier, our mental formations, when our mental formations and our perceptions, mental formations are, they're called sankhara in Pali. Sankhara refers to a number of things, but in this case, I'm referring it to mental formations. It's mental creations. We create ideas and we create all sorts of things. And it's subject to being influenced by our tendencies towards greed, ignorance, and hatred. So when they are driven by greed, ignorance, and hatred, we create worlds that are full of suffering. But in fact, they're fictions. They're not true representations of reality. They tend to obscure the vision of the way things actually are. And when we no longer feed into our mental constructions, when we can see through them as being simply kind of tainted perceptions, for example, and mental constructions, mental formations and perceptions, and when we can see through that, we see that they're just fantasies. It doesn't mean we get rid of them necessarily, and sometimes we can still live in that role that we're creating, or live in that world that we create with our mind, but we see through it. We see it for what it really is. It's like we pull away the veils of delusion, and what's revealed is our awakened nature. What is revealed is being awake. We wake up to reality. We wake up to the way things actually are, and we live from that perspective. So I mentioned earlier a little bit about signless samadhi, and I'll give more explanations as we proceed in this talk. But when I practice signless samadhi, or similar practices such as silent illumination, not that I'm very familiar with silent illumination or shikantaza, but for me they're the same practices. They're just different names for the same practices. It feels like, when I'm doing these practices, it feels like I'm taking the red pill, like Neo. It feels like that I begin to wear away those mental constructions that I've created and create, that I call the world, and I begin to see through them. And I begin to see reality as it actually is. Empty of self, empty of this fiction of self, and empty of delusional creations, being present. So, in Chan and Zen Mahayana practices, emptiness practices are called silent illumination in Chan practices, and shikantaza in Zen meditation practices. And in my view, signless samadhi, as it is practiced as one of the steps to the realization of emptiness, actually it's the last step before nibbana actually. It is, all these meditation practices are, in my experience and my view, the same. They're pointing to the same perspective. And throughout my meditation history, I've mostly practiced within early Buddhist Theravada practices. But I've also practiced in Tibetan Mahayana and Zen Mahayana approaches. And one thing that I noticed, as I was mentioning in the orientation for this day, what I've noticed is that with early Buddhism, it's much about cultivating insight, cultivating serenity. And with the the joining and the bringing together of serenity and insight, what happens is we cultivate wisdom and we see things as they actually are. It's about developing things. But what I've noticed in the Mahayana practices, as I mentioned earlier, it is about, actually I'll come back a bit, the thing that I noticed with early Buddhism, it's much about letting go of craving, clinging, and letting go of that which feeds into ignorance, that which feeds into delusion. So it's about letting go. It's about cultivating and letting go. This is early Buddhist Theravada approaches. With the Mahayana approaches, on the other hand, the practices are about waking up to what is already there. So with early Buddhist stuff, early Buddhist practices, it's very much about cultivating a perspective and letting go of things, letting go of delusions, letting go of greed, ignorance, and hatred. Whereas with the Mahayana practices, it's also about letting go in practice, but it is about waking up to what is already there. Waking up to pulling aside the veils that cover our awareness, veils that cover our untainted and there's a term in early Buddhism that's called defilements. The kilesa, there's a term called kilesa in Pali. Kilesa actually means distorted perspectives, distorted behaviors, distorted tendencies. Kilesa actually means mental distortions, but often when you hear about the translation of kilesa, it comes out as defilement, and it kind of, I guess, when you think of if the mind is kind of like a glass of water, clear, then if you put dye into the glass of water, or you put mud and all sorts of other things, it's defiled of its purity. So often the term defilement is used in early Buddhism. And I tend not to use it like that. I tend to say mental distortions because I think people have less reaction to that, and it makes more sense. It makes more meaningful sense for them. But anyway, what happens with the practice? It's like we have a glass of water. It's filled up with mud or impurities or whatever it is, and we sift through that with our practice. We sift through it, and our practice keeps kind of taking out those impurities, so that what we're left with is just a clean, clear glass of water, or as an analogy, a clear mind. Just this mind of a clear awareness. So the Tibetan Mahayana practices, as I mentioned earlier, meditation is called Gom, which means familiarization. So what we do is we become familiar with the awakened mind. We become familiar with our true nature. Sometimes they talk about it as original mind. That's in Zen Buddhism anyway. We become aware of awake awareness, the Buddha's awareness. Well, it's actually not owned by anybody, but it's already a thing. It's just awareness. And both of these perspectives about letting go and cultivating and waking up to what's already there, they lead to the same place. And they're just different perspectives on a way to wake up. So in the Zen teachings, there is a famous sutta, or not a famous sutta, a principal sutta. It's called the Heart Sutta, and it's about emptiness. And here are some of the phrases of this Heart Sutta. Form is no other than emptiness. Emptiness, no other than form. Form is only emptiness, emptiness only form. Feeling, thought and choice and consciousness itself are the same as this. All things by nature void. They are not born nor destroyed, nor are they stained or pure, nor do they wax or wane. So in emptiness, no form, no feeling, thought or choice. There is no consciousness, no eye, no ear, nose, tongue, body, mind. No colour, smell, sound, touch, taste, or what the mind takes hold of. Not even the act of sensing. Nor ignorance or end of it, nor all that comes from of ignorance. No withering, no death, no end to them, nor is there pain or cause of pain, or cease in pain, or noble path to lead from pain, not even wisdom to attain. Attainment too is emptiness. It's pretty, you're saying, what are they talking about here? You know, what do they mean by this? And it is about emptiness, and I hope I can help make sense of it in what I'll speak about in a few moments. So there are a few ways of understanding emptiness, and I've given talks on this many times. One way we can understand emptiness is that it is empty, that emptiness is full of causes and conditions. It's full to the brim of causes and conditions. And this means that it's kind of interdependent. One way we can understand emptiness is that it is empty of single thingness. Things don't arise in and of themselves, but they arise because of interdependent conditions and causes coming together. Things arising together and coming out as produced. Things are produced by causes and conditions coming together in an interdependent way. There's a famous phrase in the sutta. It goes something like this: when this is, that is. When this is not, that is not. In other words, when you have the conditions for suffering, you will have suffering. When you don't have the conditions for suffering, you won't have suffering. There'll be freedom. So this is one way of understanding emptiness, as no single thing in and of itself. And things arise because of causes and conditions coming together. There's no single thing in all this. Another, including yourself, by the way. Another way one can understand emptiness is as absence of something. And this is what the way it's described in the Chula Shunyata Sutta, or the shorter discourse on emptiness, the Buddha's shorter discourse on emptiness. And the Buddha starts with talking about how the sutta goes something like this. It begins with Ananda asking the Buddha whether he regularly abides in emptiness. And the Buddha says, yes, I do regularly abide in emptiness. And this is how I do it. I will give you the steps to the gradual path of emptiness. So what the Buddha begins with saying is that here we're in a park, a meditation center. It wasn't called a center in those days, but it was a park where there was some monastics, and there was trees, and it was quite peaceful. They were all meditating. He said, this place is empty of busyness. It is empty of gold and silver and markets and kings and queens and the retinue, and it's empty of elephants and all sorts of busyness. So in this way, we can abide in emptiness of that. We can abide in the emptiness of busyness. We can abide in the absence of busyness. So then he goes on. He says, by focusing on the forest and the peacefulness And just this sangha of monastics, we can abide in emptiness of elephants and busyness and kings and retinues and all this sort of thing. And then he goes on to say, by focusing on earth, the earth here, by putting one's full perception on earth element, the element of hardness and softness and solidity, both in oneself and also externally, like the world out there, it is empty of forests, it is empty of monastics, it is empty of the retreat place, and all there is this expanse of earth element. Then he goes on. He says, by focusing on infinite spaciousness. So look, I'll just go back here a bit. It is empty of it is empty of all the issues and all the subtle dukkha that goes with being a forest, being in a forest in a place where there's just monastics and so on. So the next step was earth element, and being in earth element and perceiving that directly and abiding in that perception, it is empty of everything that goes with the monastics and being in the forest and so on, as well as the subtle dukkha related to that experience. So it's important to realize that it's empty of that subtle dukkha, that subtle dissatisfaction or limitations that arise from being in a monastery, in a meditation center. So then he goes on to talk about earth element, and then he goes on to talk about spaciousness, boundless spaciousness, the perception of boundless spaciousness, which is something we can perceive. This body here, I'm talking to you from a physical body. It's earth element, water element, fire element, and air elements. But it is occupying a space. So if I can perceive the space, I can see the emptiness of all those elements in my body. In addition, I'm looking at here and I can see trees and so on, and there's space between me and the trees. So if I focus on the space rather than focusing on the trees, I can see the emptiness of trees and space. I can see the emptiness of materiality, actually, and emptiness of an absence of all that goes with materiality, all the subtle dukkha that goes with materiality. And it goes on. Then the next step is consciousness, boundless consciousness. And that is empty of the subtle dukkha related to spaciousness. Then it goes on. Perceiving nothingness. And in this case, nothingness refers to no self and that which belongs to a self. And I won't go into great explanations of this right now. But by perceiving that, the experience is empty of whatever subtle dukkha goes with the experience of boundless consciousness. And then it goes on. Whatever to focus on signless samadhi, actually, without signs, something without signs. And this then is empty of the subtle suffering of that insight into not self. So the signless samadhi is the final step before entering nibbana. It's the closest to what we find in nibbana. Actually, nibbana or nirvana has three features: signless samadhi, emptiness, and desirelessness. So if we can abide in signless samadhi, it's the closest thing we can get to being in nibbana without actually being in nibbana, or experiencing nibbana, or having the realization of nibbana, I should say. So I got off on a little bit of a tangent there. I wanted to talk about that a little bit later, but when I think of the practicing emptiness, and I think of signless samadhi as a really powerful step. And I was talking about trying to understand the Heart Sutra, and another way we can understand emptiness here is by understanding and considering Taoism and the yin yang sign. I don't know if everybody, you know what the yin yang sign is like. It's this, usually the classic example of the yin yang sign is like two tadpoles, swimming in a circular direction. When we think about that, the yin yang sign, it's like we know one thing by its relationship to another. So we know black in comparison to white. If there's no black, then there's no white. White makes it, in comparison or in relationship to black, white is white and black is black. But if there was no white, there would also be no black. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I'll try to clarify it a little bit more. If there's no space, for example, then there would be no matter. Matter and space are kind of opposites. So, and within a little bit of, so one thing needs the other to define it. We need white to define it. And the thing about that little dot of black in the white tadpole and the little circle of black within the white tadpole, it means that within any one thing there's a bit of the other, if that makes sense. So space is defined by its opposite, matter. And pain is also defined by no pain. If there wasn't pain, there wouldn't be such a thing as no pain. So does that make sense to you guys? I mean, yeah. Okay. It might sound really philosophical, but it's actually quite practical, because it offers, for example, a pain management technique. When you are experiencing pain, either emotional or physical, it's useful to ask yourself, what else is here? What else is here? Because we tend to just, if we have pain, we tend to just focus on the pain as our total reality. This is all there is. We get consumed by it. But if we ask ourselves, what else is here? We can see that we are also, not only is there the pain, but there is the awareness of pain. And sometimes practitioners manage pain by immersing themselves and coming from the perspective of the awareness of pain, rather than being immersed and totally consumed by the experience of pain. I don't know if that makes sense or not. And in this case, in that case, one is being aware of awareness. And sometimes mindfulness is described as this, like the practice of being aware of experience. And mindfulness is a very useful way to deal with suffering. We tend to get caught up in suffering. If we can be mindful of it, it gives us a perspective of it. This idea that within everything there is its opposite. The same is true for the Four Noble Truths, for example. And the Four Noble Truths are kind of understood simultaneously, even though they're sometimes presented in a sequence. So if there's no suffering, there's no freedom from suffering. And the classic example that Thich Nhat Hanh spoke about, no mud, no lotus. That refers to, if there's no mud, there's no suffering, then there's no lotus, which is symbolic of freedom from suffering. So coming back to that pain, what we're doing is we're coming from seeing the totality of the experience rather than being fixated on one experience. And this practice is very much about seeing, the practice of silent illumination anyway, as I've heard it described, is very much about being present with the totality of the experience. So you're just present with the totality of the experience, and you see the freedom in that moment, in that presence. So, and silence, I'll just continue to talk along what I plan to talk about rather than going on diversions. But anyway, in June and July, just like 2 months ago or a month ago, I went on a form of pilgrimage to Uluru. You're all Australians, so you know where Uluru is. And it was something that I wanted to go on for about 43 years. Ever since I had some intense experiences in Thailand as a monastic, I wanted to go to Uluru because I felt like it was a very important place to go. It's like the center of this. It's like the center of the circle. It's like the space in the middle of the circle. So when I went there, my partner and 2-year-old grandson and son and his partner came out a couple of days after I arrived. So I went by myself the first time, and I was kind of glad I went by myself because I could just kind of go there and meditate. When I walked up to the first place, I just burst into tears. Actually, it was just so amazing. It was so awesome in that true sense of the word. And it represented to me something about something very deeply spiritual. Even though it's a physical structure or physical thing, it was like an example of something that endures over time. And in comparison to it, like our petty issues, our petty problems, like, wars and all sorts of things, it's seen those things come and go. It's seen climate changes come and go. It's seen people come and go. It's seen species come and go. It's seen, it's been on the earth. It's been connected to the earth at the same time as wars have destroyed whole civilizations. It's something that's enduring, and in comparison to it, our measly selves. Not that I'm saying that we're not important, but we tend to over exaggerate our importance as a self. But in perspective, it's nothing really. So when I was there, I connected with the place, the Uluru, and I could also access a sense of silence and stillness of the place. Like, even though there was lots of tourists and tour guides talking about the geology of Uluru and bicycles and people walking around and helicopters and all sorts of things, there was a capacity to see the silence or tune into the silence. I wasn't rejecting the busyness and the noisiness and the activity. And in fact, I was kind of, I had a warm feeling towards it. But there was a certain stillness, quietude, and it felt like tuning into the unconditioned at the same time as the conditioned phenomena. It's like the yin and yang of this experience was, there was the unconditioned, and there is also the conditioned experience of tourism and people talking and myself being there and so on. So it was a really powerful experience, and it symbolized to me that, that sutta, no feeling, no thought, no choice, in that there was this great form, and there was, life as we live it, as well as that which is the unconditioned there. if that makes sense. It's like a symbol of the unconditioned. Okay, so a few months ago, actually in May, I did a retreat, an online weekend retreat with Chan Master Gyogo and Venerable Analayo, and they were both talking about emptiness, and they both spoke about emptiness from their particular perspectives. Venerable Analayo spoke about the Chula Shunyata Sutta and the graduated steps to emptiness, as it's described in that shorter discourse on emptiness. And Venerable Gyogo spoke about the developments of Buddhism over time and how it came to China and how it was adapted to the Chinese culture, and how this culture was practical and life-affirming, and therefore the practices of emptiness were very much inclined to those perspectives. And he spoke about how there's been three kind of major developments in Buddhism. There's the early Buddhism, which is the path of abandonment, as he described. And then there's the second path, or second development, is the path of transformation, which is, as far as I understand, is like this, how we transform dukkha to liberation. Like the yin-yang sign, the yin-yang sign, it builds up into being something, then it transforms to its opposite. But also in terms of understanding the Four Noble Truths and that sequence of how we need to understand dukkha, we need to understand suffering, and that when we do understand it, it gives rise to realizing the causes. When we realize the causes, we let go of those causes. Then we realize freedom, and when we realize freedom, we also realize the path to freedom, which is the fourth truth, which is this, the practice of wisdom, the practice of meditation, and the practice of ethics. This, we live that path. So the Four Noble Truths and that transformation that comes from what is symbolized by the lotus, like the lotus growing out of the shit and slime and crap at the bottom of the pond, represents this path of transformation. We need to know impatience, for example, before we know patience. We need to know suffering before we know freedom from suffering. And then he talked about the third development, which is what he called the path of recognition. The path of recognition, as far as I understand, is recognizing our true nature as awakened. It is recognizing our awareness prior to being colored by the taints and the poisons of greed, ignorance, and hatred. It is waking up to the way things are and living that prior to conceptualization about experience. And then after he did that, he guided us in a silent illumination meditation. And the way I understood this was that, first of all, he spent a lot of time encouraging us to relax, just relaxing. He actually did a progressive muscle relaxation with us, from the top of the head down, relaxing and relaxing and relaxing. And it included some movement, actually. He, got us to raise our shoulders and, wriggle our faces and, do some stretches and things like that, which was very helpful, which is what, as you psychologists know, it's what we do with progressive muscle relaxation. And then he directed us to be aware. He guided us to just be aware, free from the taints of ego, free from trying to do anything, free from trying to get anywhere, free from the the self trying to meddle with it. just completely present, open, and embracing that experience without adding anything to it, without conceptualization. He did this by suggesting we focus on the present in our bodies, and which I found really, really wonderful. It was a wonderful meditation. And I know that I've done this before many times, but I hadn't really called it silent illumination. And shikantaza, the Japanese practice of emptiness, is often translated as just sitting. And when I've done this practice, I've done this practice with some Zen masters. The instructions are just this, just here, just now, just this. And another instruction was 360 degrees look, just this, just awareness. So that's really cool. And these practices are really wonderful, and I still see them as a sign of samadhi practice. And something that, while we're meditating, Venerable Gyalgo, he read us those brief phrases on the Bahya Sutta. Remember the Bahya Sutta? I've talked about the Bahya Sutta to you sometimes. In essence, the Bahya Sutta is about Bahya, who was a teacher in northern India at the time of the Buddha. And he was, he was an elderly teacher, and he was thinking while he was just abiding by himself sometime, he was thinking, I think I'm an arahant, I must be an arahant. And one of his relatives who had recently passed away and was living in a Deva realm heard his thoughts and said to him, no, Bahya, you're not an arahant. And so Bahya said, how can I get the teachings of being an arahant? And he said, there's a teacher in central northern India that knows how to teach you how to be an arahant. So Bahya set off and walked for weeks, I think, a long way from the coast of northern India, the west coast of northern India to central India. And eventually came across the Buddha, and the Buddha was going on alms round, but he said to the Buddha, please give me the essence of the teaching. I really need to know. And the Buddha said no. And the third time he asked, he said, okay, I'll give you the essence. And this is what he said. Herein, Bahya, you should train yourself thus. In the seen will merely be what is seen. In the heard will merely be what is heard. In the sensed will merely be what is sensed. In the cognized, merely what is cognized. In this way, you should train yourself, Bahya. When Bahya, for you in the seen is merely what is seen, in the cognized is merely what is cognized, then, Bahya, you will not be with that. When Bahya, you're not with that, then Bahya, you will not be in that. When Bahya, you are not in that, then Bahya, you will neither be here nor beyond or in between the two. Just this is the end of suffering. And so after hearing that, there's a bit of a story about what happens after it, but in summary, Bahya woke up. He was awakened. And there's something about just being attentive to bare experience. When we can stay with the experience, when we can stay with the raw nature of experience, of the senses, and this includes the sense of mind, conceptualizing and so on, prior to conceptualizing about the experience, then our constructed realities break down. And we begin to see ourselves and the world around us just as things are. Just this. We are neither here nor there or anywhere in between. So look, I'm looking at the clock. I could finish up now, but I might add something. I might add something personal here, some personal experiences, if you don't mind. I would like to finish within about an hour, and I don't want to bore you too much, but I think you might find this little story kind of interesting, because it goes on to talking a little bit more about signless samadhi. So, about in 1979, I was a 23-year-old monastic living in Thailand. I was living in the northeast of Thailand in the Achan Mun tradition, and it was my particular teacher was Achan Ben. I was living in a forest temple called Wat Doi Dhamachedi, and I'd been there, a while, and I was in the Rains Retreat of 1979, and over the months I was there, I was kind of playing with meditation. The instructions at that place were pretty basic. We were just told to say Bhutto. That was the meditation instructions, Bhutto. And I'd go and talk to my teacher often, and in my limited Thai, but I could still understand Thai and converse with him. Anyway, I was on this, after a couple of months, I was playing with the practice, and I was playing with watching intentions arise, watching thoughts arise. And I knew if I fed into the thoughts, something would appear, something would happen, like there'd be a cause-effect relationship. So I played with not feeding into intentions, just watching what was happening, just being present with experience. And after a while, it got really, really interesting. It's like, rather than following a thought, following a sign, for example, like a sign of something, I would just stay present with this concept or this thought. And, it kind of led to kind of changes in my perceptions about life and myself. So in the middle of all this, my teacher come up to me and insist that I go and visit him, with him, an elderly monk, an elderly teacher who was a direct disciple of Achan Mun, a teacher called Lung Po. Lung Po means great uncle, and he's Lung Po Tet. Tet is his name. Achan Tet we used to call him at the time, but it's actually Lung Po Tet. It's a kind of an honorific term, Lung Po. And he was a famous and renowned disciple of Achan Mun, and a master of meditation. So, I went along. We took about 3 hours to drive with a couple of other monks and my teacher, Achan Ben, to up to the Mekong River. I was living in near Sokonokon in a temple called Wat Doi Dhamachedi, as I mentioned. So when we arrived, we were kind of directed to go and have an audience with this teacher, or a meeting with the teacher. Every time I've described this, I begin to cry, and I'm not sure why. And I thought I was going to be pretty good, but I might start to cry, and just don't worry about that. So as we walked in, he looked directly at me, and it was like, I know this sounds a bit cliched, but it's like he was seeing right through me, seeing my whole life, seeing everything. Everything that was wholesome, everything that was unwholesome, everything that was, my practice and so on. And I sat down with the other monks, and he looked directly at me and he said, "Let the heart abide with the heart. Stay with the heart. Stay with the heart. Jai Yogap Jai. Jai Yogap Jai." That's the Thai. But if you're thinking you're staying with the heart, you're not. So, after that encounter, which, it was pretty intense, after that encounter, I went back to the temple, and my world began to fall apart. It started to crumble. It felt like I'd had LSD beforehand. I've had a few mushroom trips before I was a monastic. A bit like an LSD trip. A bit like, psilocybin as well. But it lasted for months. And it was like a dream in some respects. And I might have looked like, by the way, that coincided with contracting hepatitis A and needing to go to hospital for a bit and getting the test. But I ended up staying, actually I didn't go to hospital, I just got the test. I went to hospital to get the test, but ended up staying in the temple. And I might have looked a little bit mad to some people. And, some people might have said I was having the corruptions of insight. But for me, it was really amazing. It was like I'd found this space in my heart that was enduring. It was quiet. It was still. All the rest of the stuff was happening around me, but there was a sense of great security in my heart. And it led to a whole range of things, including me disrobing and getting married, and within a week of meeting my future wife. It was, I won't go into all those details, but so yeah, it took me a long time to integrate that kind of those experiences. And now fast forward 43 years to last year, when I was doing an emptiness retreat with Venerable Analio. So I'm on this retreat, and by the way, the intensity of those experiences faded away over time, and I tried to integrate them in my life, and I think I've been reasonably successful. Fast forward, retreat last year, a 10-day retreat online with Analio, and he's going through the gradual steps to emptiness. And every step was mind-blowing. You just go, wow, I've done these practices before, but I'd never in this kind of systematic way. Then we get to the instructions for signless samadhi. And these instructions are to stay present and not fall for feeding into signs. Now, a sign relates to the term nimitta. Is in Pali it's called nimitta. Though nimitta that term is sometimes used for objects of meditation and in the practice of jhanas. In its original sense, the term nimitta means a sign of something. And like, for example, a sign that I've got a sore stomach is, pain is a sign that I might have, pain in my stomach might be a sign that I've got a problem in my belly. Or I'm looking at you guys there and I can see faces. I recognize you. The way I recognize you is because you have a sign about you. I recognize the nimitta. Even if you were to, most of you have aged about 3 months since I last saw you. But even if I hadn't seen you for 20 years, I'd still recognize the sign of you. Signs are concepts and perceptions and ways we make sense of the world. They are essentially concepts. So the instructions in this particular meditation is to not feed into constructs, not to feed into signs. Have no sign. Don't pick up a sign and make it your object. Signs in meditation, I've often taught you guys, the way we practice loving kindness meditation, for example, the way I practice it and the way I share to practice it, is find a sign of that experience, like something you could hook into that represents loving kindness, and then go with that, stay with that sign. Like, encourage you to think of a lovely pet, or favorite person, or someone who's lovable, and there's a sign of loving kindness that arises in your heart. that becomes your object of meditation. What we're saying here with signless samadhi is you don't grab onto a sign. Nothing. You stay present. Which is the same as what the instructions that Bahia was given, essentially. And for me, it is this experience of going through the steps to emptiness, and then arriving at this point, and just staying there, staying with awareness. And you'll notice lots of nimittas or signs come up, like you want to go into a concept of something. Even say the concept of breathing, for example, you might be breathing and you say, oh, I'll just go into that sign of breathing, the sign that represents breathing for me. But you restrain, you stay back, you stay present. And when I practiced this with Analio, it was like not going into anything, but also not resting back and settling back into anything. And I use the term hovering, just hovering in the present with Analio, and he just said, yes, that's a good description, hovering. So when we do that, we're no longer feeding into the constructions of our world. We've taken the red pill, so to speak, and the world changes, and we begin to become more open to seeing things as they actually are, and more ready for the experience of nirvana. So, thank you everyone. I think that's probably enough for the talk today. I hope it's been helpful. And let's have a few moments silence before we have some discussion and go into another guided meditation.